My name's Gordon Hughes. I'm the Global Sales Director for Financial Services at Alliances at Intel. And I'm sort of going to do a brief introduction and hand over to my friend Sinan, who's going to talk more about what MarkLogic are doing in financial services. So just by way of a brief introduction, you may be wondering, and I get this quite often, as to why is Intel here? Intel does processors, don't they? Well, yeah, we do processors, but we do an awful lot more than that. You know, we have processing technology, including, I mean, you may be aware that we recently bought Altera, so we have FPGAs, we have CPUs, we have many cored CPUs, we have storage technology, including solid-state drives, non-volatile memory, we have networking fabric. We also have a lot of software as well, mainly software tools. One thing that you may not know is that if the software business in Intel was taken out as a separate business, then it would be the third largest software vendor in the world. So we have a real broad spectrum portfolio technology. So because of that, one of the things that we need to do when we engage with customers is understand the business issues, because we're not just selling point products. We need to understand what the business issues are, and then we need to work with our partners to develop and define business solutions that absorb all our technology and provide, you know, a complete business solution to the customer. So with that in mind, now turning to the financial services industry, that's the financial services industry has always been a big focus industry over the years anyway, because it's probably, you know, the biggest industry when it comes to high-performance compute, everything from the investment banking side through to, you know, sort of low-latency trading, high-frequency trading, risk calculations, and there's just so much happening in that industry that can leverage Intel technology. If we step back and look at the pressures on that industry at the moment, there are two major areas of pressure. One, this comes as no surprise at all, and we all know it, the financial services industry, huge pressure from the regulators. You know, that was clear from the conversations in the KPMG session yesterday, and we're all acutely aware of that, the numerous regulators and regulations that are hitting that industry. The other thing that is putting a lot of pressure on the industry is competition. There are disintermediators, there are challenger banks emerging now. Has anybody heard of PSD2, the Revised Payment Services Directive that's been passed by the European Parliament? I won't go into the detail of that, but that is going to cause huge disruption in the financial services industry, because it's going to open up that industry to all sorts of third parties who are going to directly compete with the banks. So there's those two huge pressures hitting the industry. So if we look at the trends in the industry, or the themes in the industry, we, as Intel, have identified three major themes or activities in the industry. One is around digitization. So that is taking non-digitized processes and digitizing those. And we heard about that in Michael Henry's session, in the KPMG session yesterday, and what they're doing in terms of digital labor, looking at KYC. There's a whole area of transformation in the data center. So thinking about, you know, sort of migrating off older legacy systems, aggregating and consolidating data silos. We heard about that in the keynotes yesterday from David at MarkLogic. And the third area is around innovation, and this is a whole area of data management and analytics. There's a lot of activity in the fintech space with new types of analytical processes. You'll hear conversations about neural networks, deep learning, machine learning, and all those sort of things. So that all those things are hitting in the industry. And it's interesting because all those three areas that are being addressed by MarkLogic. If we look at the innovation area in terms of data management and analytics, and we're going to focus on one particular area of that around regulatory reporting in this session, you know, all the three areas I've just talked about have been covered this week in the sessions we're hearing from MarkLogic. So with that in mind, I'll pass over to Sinan now to focus in on some of the work that Intel and MarkLogic have been doing to jointly address the issues around regulatory reporting in the financial services industry. Sinan.
Thank you, Gordon. So I'll just remind you of the environment we're all working in. Most of the information that flows in the financial system is increasingly being subject to regulations, some of them didn't exist as early as 6-7 years ago. And some of them are being enforced far more diligently and across borders. It's creating a requirement to not only move the data much quicker, but retain a lot more data in a manner that is accessible to the banks, auditors, and regulators. And the volume of the data and the variety of data is increasing, and it will not end anytime soon, as the new regulations, like the one Gordon mentioned, is going to mount, and that produces a lot of stress in the data management infrastructure. The imperative is real, and it is being, especially in Europe, enforced with a certain diligence and consistency that we haven't seen before in the 90s and in the earlier times. Basel III probably going to be succeeded by Basel IV, not to negate what was required before, but also add to it. And the roles and responsibilities and the way things are done, the regulatory cycle is being managed by the banks, is also being regulated. It's not only what you do when you do it, but how you do it has become under regulatory purview. And the answer is essentially, it comes down to what you use technology and how you automate and how you bring in accuracy, security, and accessibility, and preferably in one homogeneous infrastructure. The data is not homogeneous to any degree that would make it easy, and therefore there are intelligent solutions that need to be brought to bear to understand the variety of the data and the intrinsic value of different types of different formats of data, but still be able to go through the aggregation path and produce the reports on time. So when we look at the audience we address ourselves to with Intel and MarkLogic, we have the CEO who's really worried about growth, top line, bottom line growth, COO execution, CIO enablement of the corporate functions, and the chief financial officer and the treasury officer about the risk, exposure of the balance sheet, risk of the capital, and the operational risks, including reputational risk. When we look at the return on equity in sector-wise, banking doesn't rank at the top. It's still under financial stress, but it is not as bad as it used to be 4 or 5 years ago. It is not in the 2%, 3%, or even negative anymore. It's reasonably, recent history-wise, relatively healthy, 10%. And as that balance sheet health improves, hopefully in the years to come, there will be additional investment available to streamline operations and become more compliant, become more automated, and provide more secure and highly performant platforms for the movement of data and management of the risks. So regulations essentially impose an imperative to invest in the transparency of the information that flows and make that information visible internally and to the regulators. But running the business is not any easier. There's been tremendous consolidation in the industry. Banks are bigger. They have absorbed other organizations and through mergers and acquisitions have inherited even more diverse and heterogeneous IT infrastructures. And they have to manage that complexity, and one of the ways to do that is disintermediate the fragmentation of information, eliminate silos, and that's where we play very strongly and put a claim to both competence and scale in terms of eliminating silos, at least reducing them. Innovation is ever present. The larger, consolidated, bigger enterprises now competing for the customer far more diligently, and product innovation, innovation in services is the way to acquire new customers. They have to acquire one another's customers, incent, cross-selling and make the customer a more complete, more involved customer for their offerings. So being able to deploy to market in time and ahead of the competition is the third imperative. And the customers, not only to be able to cross-sell to the customers, not only to expand the wallet share of the customer, but also to be able to account for what the customers do, partly as part of the regulations, but partly as part of understanding the customer, has also become an imperative, and that's the fourth one. Be able to profile the customer properly so you can understand and service the customer. If need be able to audit and account for customer behavior and customer transactions to the regulators and litigators if need be. So given that, we have a solution architecture with MarkLogic to facilitate both internal governance and regulatory reporting. And we rely definitely on the underlying technologies, and the most important one is the technologies we rely on from Intel. So I will let Gordon go into the Intel technology as the foundational technology that we all rely on.
Okay.
And
thanks, Sinan. So yeah, so this is really what we've been doing with MarkLogic and other partners in different industries. We're looking at solution areas and then working with folks like MarkLogic to define solution plays or solution architectures that address, sort of key hotspots in the industry. And the big one that we identified with MarkLogic is around regulatory reporting. So if we go into the next slide, this is a high-level view. This is just representative of the sort of issues that the banks are facing. So, if we look at the sources of data here, there's data coming from the trading systems, there's event stream processing, market data, reference data streams entering the trade repository, which is typically a tiered storage. You're going to store your trades there, your counterparties, your reference tables, and legal documentation. The banks have huge high-performance grids doing risk calculations on these. These can be tens upon tens of thousands of processing cores acting on that grid. And in here, there's the need to look at this data and now correlate this data for the purposes of regulatory reporting. So what the banks now have to do, they have to take their legal documentation and they have to report on the trades that are being executed by the counterparties against the legal contract between those counterparties. And this is actually quite complex reporting requirements, which is very, very well serviced by MarkLogic's NoSQL database. There are analytical components that are required. SAS Analytics is just one example of the components there. And then there's the need to build a regulatory store. When I first started talking about this solution both to MarkLogic and also to the banks, what amazed me was that most of the banks today do not have a regulatory store. They produce reports from their trade repository, send the reports to the regulators, but what they haven't been doing is actually capturing those reports and storing them in a regulatory store so they can go back to them later on. And again, this is one of the key things that MarkLogic can facilitate. XBRL, Extensible Business Reporting Language, is becoming the de facto reporting language to the regulators. And again, this is something that is very well facilitated by the capabilities in MarkLogic's NoSQL database. There's a need to store that and then maybe revisit that and report back to the regulators. And that will be submitted to the different regulators in the different countries. And it's not one regulator per country, right? Because you have many different types of regulation per country, and all that needs to be reported out at different time intervals to the regulators, be it daily, weekly, monthly, or annually. The other thing that causes real pain in the banks is stress testing or ad hoc reporting, because the regulators can go back to the banks at any point in time and say, I want you to rerun your reports, right? And I want you to change the parameters against the reports, assume a different rate of inflation, assume this, assume that. For those of you who live in the UK, you've may seen some of this happening about a year or so ago when three of the major banks, I think it was RBS, Lloyds, and the Co-op Bank, where the regulators demanded they stress test their systems, and I think RBS just scraped through by the skin of the teeth, but correct me on that, I think Co-op Bank actually failed on that. That's what was happening. The regulators were going back to the banks and asking them to rerun their reports and stress test their systems with a different set of parameters. And that's a particularly painful process that the banks have to go through. You know, it's very, very expensive and painful. So this is really why we worked with MarkLogic to put this architecture together to address those particular sorts of issues that the banks are facing. You know, what's not shown on here is the possible ingestion of things like data from social media sites. The volume of data that needs to be ingested here is only going to grow. There are going to be more and more sources that the banks need to ingest. I think just the legal documentation alone can absorb up to a petabyte of storage. This is, you know, this is huge amounts of storage, again, which MarkLogic is very well suited to cope with, as you have done so both in financial services but other industries as well. So, so one of the things that we do when we work with MarkLogic is actually make sure that they're taking advantage of the latest Intel technology. So there's a bit of a plug for our latest product, our latest version of the Xeon processor family. We work very closely with the MarkLogic development teams and make sure that their products are optimized to run on Intel technology. And here we have quotes here from Kayo Milani, who's the Director of Product Management at MarkLogic, citing the way MarkLogic has been working with Intel both to use our solid-state drive technology and the latest Intel Xeon processors. A lot more information about this, some graphs here about how our latest Xeon processors are actually increasing the performance of queries on the MarkLogic database. I'm not going to go into this in technical detail. If you want more information, please talk to myself or Sinan offline. We can give you a wealth more information, but I'm not going to turn this into a product pitch. Anyway, on that note, I'll hand back to Sinan.
Okay, thank you very much. So based on what you have listened to about the generations of Intel processors and the storage devices that we use, we highlight capabilities that we have to deal with the entire regulatory cycle, and one of them is the scale-out commodity hardware. Other than we deploy in units, I think right now it's 8 core units of server. That gives you some vertical scalability, but as you would appreciate, we need the horizontal scale-out. And that's where Intel helps us leverage out that capability. We can use commodity hardware and be able to extend the computing capacity as the volume of data and the processes on that data become more and more complex, and the volume continues to increase. The tiered storage gives us the capability to actually establish some policies about aged data. Since now we are dealing with the requirement to have data, deep archival data, available on demand to auditors and regulators, and that demand is not going to go anywhere. We can't wait for a couple of days to harvest the data, historical data, and present it for investigation or litigation if need be. It has to be accessible and online. That's an expensive proposition if you keep everything real-time accessible, but actually you can deploy aged data to lower-priced hardware storage devices and keep the near real-time data on a faster access media. Then you can actually establish some very intelligent aging policies for very large amounts of data and still meet the requirements. Semantics gives us an entirely different way of accessing data and make inferences based on relationships. Our ability to transform data into RDFs and apply semantics and ontology to it makes us a lot easier. It makes it a lot easier for the users to establish the relationships that are not all that obvious when you look at the raw data. We are transaction compliant, so if you're collecting data from a transactional flow, we will maintain the transactional integrity as the unit of transmission of data that is coming in and be able to reconstruct that transaction when we look at the data for investigative purposes. We do not lose the that unit of work concept of a transaction when we capture it from a transactional flow. Bitemporal capability is one of the very strong differentiators of MarkLogic right now as a NoSQL platform. It allows us to ask the question, who knew what when? We can establish the data events on 2 timelines and be able to go back and reconstruct how that particular information was used at a point in given time, in what context. And we never lose that temporal relationship between different timelines. Geospatial has been around for a while, and MarkLogic as a capability came out of law enforcement and intelligence requirements, intelligence community's requirements. Now we can correlate physical location with data events, with movement of data, and some analytics on that data, and be able to give you a time and physical space based inference on what is happening when and where. Real-time alerting is our ability to actually establish and automate an alerting mechanism based on data events and relationships between data events, so that we can notify the user that there's some anomaly, if you would, or some reinforcement of some behavior that is under observation, and be able to lead them to a more thorough analysis of what has been happening. And we can do that by establishing alerting rules at ingestion time. In government-grade security, we've been certified to be a secure platform by the federal government. We have encryption policies and algorithms applied to the data at ingestion time and when the information is committed to the storage device. And we have gone through the certification process, and I think, again, I think we are the only NoSQL platform that has received that degree of certification. If I'm not mistaken, if I'm mistaken, Ken will correct me. So most of the data that regulatory process requires right now achieves is going through many hops, and that is wasted capital and time, and valuable time is being lost to validate the data in transit and when it arrives. And we are trying to reduce that cost and the time, and we would like to capture some of this $36 billion spent on innovation and new applications rather than catching up with the data itself. So relational databases are good if we're dealing with pure OLTP transactions, and we need that transaction flow come in, but that doesn't mean we have to live with the encumbrances and the limitations of many steps of ETL and the risk of actually corrupting data in due process or desynchronizing data flow from related data flows and then try to establish that temporal relationship later on. The database solution that we offer to integrate faster and provide access, searchable, queryable database leverages essentially 2 strengths of the Intel technology: the processing speed and access to memory, the RAM memory. We rely on availability of RAM space, addressable space within our server processes in order to not only accelerate the data processing, but also be able to keep data in full view as we're manipulating it and validating it. And everything I described to you up until this point is taking advantage of the increased clock speed of the processors, the multi-core architecture of the processor, so that we can fragment the workload within a processor across cores, and then be able to use the addressable memory that is available to the processor in each core in some very intelligent way, so that we can actually keep both the data flow moving and the data intrinsic processes we have in sync. So our solution is address the data capture problem, regardless of what format and shape the data is in. We will capture it, we will ingest it. We can get the data and the relationships between data out through a search engine and the query facilities and the semantics that we have. And we can keep it secure, wholesome, a holistic image of the data, and control the access by different user groups with access protocols and policies. And by doing that, we will be able to deploy in on-premise or in the cloud same capabilities and be able to use AWS and Azure as our deployment partners. We can interface with other technologies like Hadoop. We can interface with the business intelligence platforms for visualization and analysis. So those are our credentials. For a regulatory reporting cycle, as well as internal governance and auditing, we are giving a complete and coherent view of the data and be able to maintain the temporal relationships between data events across both the transactional streams of data and harvested data from social media and other streams and other sources. So that concludes my presentation. I'll entertain questions, and I'm sure Gordon will be taking questions and comments. Okay. All right. Yeah.
It's for both of you guys. Gordon, you talked about how banks, they don't have a regulatory store, as you call it. And what do you estimate the savings could be of having a store and even qualitatively versus having to run reports all the time? And how would you feel, what would that store look like?
Well, it would be.
Like trades, reference data. I think we went over your reference targets. Double click on that.
That's right. Well, I mean, it is a qualitative sort of assessment, really. I mean, the conversation to have with the banks is, have the conversation around what is the pain of stress testing or doing the ad hoc reporting, because they're going to get more and more of that coming down from the regulators.
The regulators wouldn't want a specific store because they want to know that you're using the real data that you used at the time and where you got it from.
Yeah.
What do you know when you did it? And keep going across what the bank is using rather than a specific reg store. The regulators push back against saying just build the reg store. So they feel it won't be real data.
Right. So the notion as a regulatory store as a side effect of all the reports you've run over time, is that an accurate
Correct.
assessment?
Yeah, that's right. The other thing I didn't discuss on that particular slide was the fact that, just to keep it simple, there's almost a mirror image of part of that will be implemented by the regulators themselves in their own data centers, because the regulators themselves are acquirers of technology. So, they're going to receive those reports. They're going to have to do their own analysis on those reports, and then they, as I understand it, they issue the requirements for ad hoc report and stress testing back to the bank in an XBRL format. So there's a vicious circle going on there. We know that most of the regulators, as I say, are acquiring technology. So, from a vendor point of view, there's an opportunity to engage with the regulators there. I mean, the other thing about the regulators and technology is the regulations themselves can actually be somewhat vague when it comes to implementing technology solutions. The regulations themselves can be very, very fuzzy. I mean, one of the things I mentioned PSD2, one of the things the banks are struggling with at the moment, what on earth does this stuff mean in terms of technology? If the regulation is saying I need to open up my systems to allow third-party payment providers get access to the customer data that I hold for my customers. How do I do that? Now, a lot of people talk about that in terms of APIs. Nowhere in PSD2 is the term API ever mentioned, right? So there's a lot of second guessing by the banks that goes on when it comes to interpreting what do those regulations mean. From our point of view, right, the important thing is flexibility. You've got to have an agile and flexible solution, right? You're not going to achieve that through a traditional relational database, right? What you are going to do is be able to achieve that through using MarkLogic, NoSQL. I mean, in fact, some of the regulations are even almost, if you take, I can't give specific examples, but I know talking to people, some of the regulations are almost contradictory. One regulation will say something about, knowledge of customers, and another regulation will say that something that seems to be diametrically opposed to that regulation over there. It's, it's a minefield.
I mean, if you, well, we shouldn't presume some technological depth on part of the regulators when they make these regulations and explain it in paragraphs and words. But if you go back to one of the earlier quotes from McKinsey research, where they almost imply data lake or data lakes as the medium where you would go to get your first order access to information. But the proviso of that is, whatever it is, data warehouse or data lake, it has to maintain the progression of data and the modifications and transformations of data in time. So that if you want to get the chronology of something you're investigating, it has to be unraveled with the time dimension, and then you'll be able to say who did what when, and if it's the wrong thing or inadvertently done because the data was corrupt or wrong or incomplete. If you can retain, right, but if the requirement, implicit requirement is that degree of capability and granularity, it is not just piling of data in one place that you can get all the data accessible, but how did that data became that data from the origin to the point of use? That's what they're interested in.
But talked about relationships, so which you got me thinking about another question. Relationships between things, and you also mentioned innovation and regulation sort of converging. So when I think relationships, we think about semantic relationships. We think of a complex, say, legal entity hierarchy, and that makes you think of sort of like a graph type of thing, and semantic capability. And then I hear about FIBO out there trying to model stuff. Can you guys give some insight into how you think that is progressing or should progress with respect to regulation and innovation? Or is that
first of all, FIBO is an initiative that may succeed or be adopted or not. But beside FIBO, the use of semantics and ontology, there are two ways to think about it. One is define a vocabulary and taxonomy about things that people use, like a bond or stock, and then accumulate a language to describe what bonds do for a person or an institutional investor, what an equity does as part of an allocation model in a portfolio. Or, from a regulator's point of view, you look at processes, and the bank's CFO or treasurer is going to look at, say, liquidity management as a process. So how do I automate all the decisions that I make around liquidity management using ontology? Then you have a very different approach to building ontologies. I'm not going to build an ontology to describe financial instruments or accounting concepts. I'm going to describe an ontology that feeds into a well-defined process. I may have a different ontology for liquidity risk management than plain vanilla liquidity management or collateral management. That is the difference in approach. If I were a regulator, I'm going to see what is ontology going to do for me. I'm going to say it will make me understand the process better, automate the process, and be able to make that process scrutable, that I can go and analyze at a very granular level. A technologist's impulse or an academician's impulse would be start with the words we use and then enrich them through ontology, ascribe some meaning to it, when I say stock, I don't mean the stock in the store, but I mean shares of a company, and then dividend and all of those things, you can build an ontology around it. So that's the technologist's impulse to build up ontology. The regulators would look at the process, yeah, and start there and then say, is it controllable? Is it governable? Is it scrutable? Is it automated? And is it going to keep the data, all of the data in time? The other, what was the first question was about?
What I asked Gordon about the regulatory store, or?
No, the question you asked before you mentioned FIBO.
Yeah, it was related to that.
Yeah.
Do they play a role, do you see them playing a role in helping regulation, or are they more interested in just defining what things are called?
Yeah, no, I mean, there is no government entity that I would call a regulator in the FIBO activities today. Very few banks, even there are about only 3 of them that appear to be sponsors. A lot of it is driven by technology companies or consultants or academics. So I don't know if the regulators actually are aware that there are ontology building societies emerging all over the place.
So there's some work going on. I mean, there's things like, I don't know if you're aware of the EDM Council. Yeah, so that's a non-profit organisation. And this is something they're trying to address. They're trying to bring the banks together, largely the chief data officers in the banks, and also have some interaction with the regulators to define common ontologies. So they're working on that. It wasn't not necessarily specifically to address the issues around regulatory reporting, but it is a work stream, and they're looking at all sorts of different things there. I mean, it's a worthy venture. We'll have to see how much, and if you look at the board of directors for the EDM Council, it's like a who's who of chief data officers in the major banks, right? How much traction they're getting with the regulators right now, I'm not sure. You've got other initiatives, things like the Open Banking Working Group, who are working, as it happens, on things like APIs. The complexity of the industry is such that, what the Open Banking Working Group is doing, it's got nothing to do with PSD2, because it was a work stream started before PSD2 hit the banks. But then you can see how these things potentially could converge in the same way that the EDM Council is doing work around ontologies. It's interesting, as the Chinese would say.
Is that the regulations start with politicians who are world famous for having no brains and no knowledge about whatever they write regulations about. And it starts from there, and it feeds down, and then somebody else has to interpret it into sensible regulations, and then we have to try and make it work.
Yes.
I can end it, but do you see blockchain or distributed ledger technology disrupting this area? Sorry.
We almost got away with it.
Potentially, it could change a lot, and potentially it will remain as an interesting discussion and keeps going on. Somebody, somewhere along the line, I mean, it's either a de facto standard because the businesses adopt it and become involved in it, or it is mandated through a government entity as a standard to do something. As a pure technology and technology companies pushing it or playing with it or proposing it isn't going to generate enough momentum for it to be disruptive to anything, whether it's bank payments, SWIFT, or Cybos activities and so forth. But it is a technology that's going to find its way in the next 5 to 10 years into a lot of the things that transmit information about transactions, information about exchange of physical goods. Some people are saying it will be the new barter economy and we don't need money anymore, and I can't figure out how that happens, but there are people who write about those things. So interest level will be high, but I don't think unless one of the two things happen, either companies actually invest in it for their own reasons in a major way, in a very
a lot of the US, but in the UK, all the major banks have got, particularly in the payments area, they've got a blockchain study group.
Yeah.
And they're funding fintech organizations.
Well, but whoever's looking at it typically, Whoever's looking at it typically has the word innovation in their job title, and that gives you a clue.
Yeah.
The only people making money out of blockchain right now are the conference organisers, and potentially some of the big consultancies. I mean, and the real key thing is, what are the use cases? I mean, there's lots of things you could potentially implement on blockchain, right? What are the use cases where blockchain will bring real return on investment to real value add? I know one of the potential use cases, I know one particular bank that's looking at it, is trade finance. Now, that is a very, very complex process right now, which needs digitizing, and that could be one use case where blockchain would bring some real benefit to the banks. Does it bring benefit into the payment space? I don't know. I mean, why you've got technology that does that today quite happily. What benefits would blockchain, you could do it on blockchain potentially, but what benefits would blockchain bring? So these are the things that the banks are looking at right now. I mean, Intel has a sort of an interest in it. We've just released an open source, a blockchain implementation to the open source community. And just, it's not a product, we're not selling it, we just gave it to the open source community. The things that we look at are things around security and privacy, scalability and performance. And what we did a few things with a blockchain implementation that takes advantage of components down at the silicon level that help with things like security. So a little bit of Intel stickiness there. But it's partly so we can have a conversation with banks and begin to understand what the banks could potentially do. But for a company like Intel, this can be a very time-consuming conversation with the banks and lead nowhere. So,
I do have to chime in. I do want to brag, but I did an implementation of blockchain on MarkLogic. So I think regulatory compliance is a very good example where blockchain is a good use case. There's a lot of hype where blockchain is a bad use case. Someone, for example, was a blood bank backed by Bitcoin, and it's not a good idea because it's in the wrong. But regulatory compliance where blockchain is a good fit, it gives you that distributed trust. So if you've got a regulatory body and a bank, if you use blockchain and they all have copies of the blockchain, you can then in the future prove that your data was as it was, sort of equivalent to bitemporal, with the difference that you can have multiple copies that are distributed, and you can either use a hash or you can use the sort of the data itself to generate that hash again, to prove that that data now is as it was many years ago when it was reported. So the advantage of this is you don't necessarily have to store the data per se, or if you do have a separate regulative store, you can generate the hash and prove digitally, cryptographically, that this data is the same as it was when reported. So I think it's a particularly good use case.
well, the regulators are looking, I mean, I know, so we're talking about regulators and technology, so the FCA over here has created an innovation sandbox, and I know that there are some companies trying to get into that sandbox with blockchain technology. So the regulators themselves are looking. We know that SWIFT is looking at it because InnoTribe has a complete, a stream on looking at it, but it's mainly exploratory at the moment.
I mean, you mentioned trade finance. For law enforcement, could conceivably be interested for purposes of preventing money laundering, illicit gains, and track them. And they may actually say any cross-border transaction will be executed through blockchain, and we will have a virtual general ledger that we see, regardless of who you are, and that will be visible to us every step of the way. And if you're not complying this, automatically you'll be investigated because the assumption is you have illicit transaction going on. That's been in discussion between Justice Department and the Treasury Department too, and the Drug Enforcement Agency in the US is all of a sudden excited about this thing. So all of those things may actually make it more sticky and actually succeed, but you need something like that for it to actually become real rather than only investigation, exploration.
And so since we're all talking about blockchain, I'll put sort of the MarkLogic bow on it, which is if you're going to trust a community of machines to say you settle and clear, right? That's another thing. People go straight to processing, things are automatically settled. Then I say work back from that and say, if I'm going to trust machines to do that, I want the most complete and expressive view of my data possible. And so, yeah, something like MarkLogic, where you can have a very expressive view and a very complete view of the data, as well as all the interrelationships between things, is a good place to start. To say, I'm going to send a payload somewhere, and some machine's going to say yes or no to it. I don't want to be constrained by my model, right? So you can point that back to one.
Did you see some kind of hybrid of schemaless distributed ledger in the future?
Who knows, right? It's a lot more complicated than say Bitcoin, right? Because, you know, it's addition and subtraction when it comes to Bitcoin. But when you talk about something like derivative, it's a more complex calculus. It's actually calculus in some cases. So you want to representing that is a bit more complex. So who knows? Maybe there will be representations of things that can be completely expressed inside of a payload that says, yeah, this particular instrument has a value that can be determined by all the information in it, as opposed to just some number that you hope is good or not, depending upon how it got there. An old provenance that can tell the machine, yeah, this was derived from all of these underlines and this reference data somewhere over here. It's interesting, but I think we're a long way from there. You got to get the data right.
One thing to note is that with blockchain, you can only add things to it. You can't really remove anything ever by design, if it's designed properly. So if you want to amend, which happens, or there's an actual mistake, the only way you can do it is you add yet another transaction that mentions the previous one, which is not very efficient. So there are cases like regulatory compliance where not being sort of cryptographically able to remove is good, because you want to prove that it's been like that forever. But in many cases, blockchain is simply not a good match, because you can't easily edit things or amend them or change them as the world changes. So that's when it's not a good match. And I think a lot of cases, people, when they think of blockchain, they're looking actually for distributed features, so that it scales, so that it runs on many machines. So I think in that case, MarkLogic is quite a good fit, because it's got distributed features, and maybe, rather than in blockchain, let's use something distributed. That's
Okay. Anything else?
If you'd like a lighter side, I read a report the other day that, Professor Michael Manelli at ZEN, he was asked to review a report at Deutsche Bank about the way they were going to try and implement blockchain across their investment bank. And he actually calculated they would use half the world's electricity in order to do it, because they'd have so many machines scattered around doing the same stuff and keeping the same data.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
On
Thank
that
you.
note-
Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you.